Ora si registrerà la conferenza.
So apologies for that. So we're going to go through again what a basic theory of change structure looks like and what its key components are. We'll go through the steps required in developing one, and then we'll go into more detail, perhaps drawing on examples that are specifically related to your Designscape projects in terms of how you might think of drawing up a theory of change with those. So here is again the kind of flow and basic structure of a theory of change that Kerstin has already showed in the previous session. So just to reiterate, essentially that a theory of change is a way of describing and visually illustrating your project's change journey. So as you can see here, it's a little bit of a roadmap that outlines all the key steps by which you plan to achieve a goal. Now, it's important to say here that there's actually different ways of designing a theory of change. And you might want to share some of these at the end, but also in our resource pack, if you access some of the resources, you might actually find very different ways of visualizing it. But perhaps the crucial thing about a theory of change is in the process. So it's actually a process that requires you to, first of all, break down your project into its key components, and usually they're referred to with the following language. So presenting problems, inputs and activities, outputs, outcome and impacts. And we'll go through what some of that language means in a moment. But aside from breaking down your project into its key components, going through a change process also requires you to describe them in a bit of a perhaps counterintuitive way at the beginning, in a process that is often referred to as backwards mapping. So let's go through both in more detail what these components are and what backward mapping actually is. So the first step is to start with what is called the presenting problem. And this is really about articulating the issues and the problems that you aim to solve through your project. So in other words, it describes why there is a need for your project and why you've decided to set it up in the first place. Now, although the flow of a theory of change is linear, as you can see, actually doing it then requires you to move towards the kind of right end of a theory of change and looking at what in theory of change language are called impacts. And these refer essentially to the long-term aims that you want your projects to achieve. So, for example, you might aim to support young people to become more work ready. Your project might aim to contribute to climate change objectives or to improve health, social, economic conditions of particular target groups. So this is about what you're hoping to achieve in the long term. Now that you've sort of identified what the problem is and where you want to get to, you're kind of now ready to start mapping backwards. So rather than start from inputs and activities, the third step is to think about project outcomes. Now, outcomes generally refer to what are sometimes called the preconditions for a longer term aim to be achieved. So the question is, what do you need to change in the short or medium term in order for the longer term objective to come about? So again, what you're looking at in these first couple of steps are really an articulation of where it is that you want to get to. Often the reason for undertaking a backward mapping exercise, which is often different to sort of standard, more traditional project planning, is because it's sometimes helpful to start with having a clear vision of what you aim to achieve. And that can help you be a little bit more creative rather than feel constrained by the more tangible aspects of your project. Now that you've sort of articulated the changes, you're now ready to really think about, well, how will we get there? And sort of articulating what you will do. This might be the kind of simpler phase of your theory of change because it relates to quite tangible things. And normally you start with the outputs, and outputs relate to essentially your project deliverables. So what will be produced as a result of your project that are absolutely important for your changes to come about. Following outputs, you then think about inputs and activities, and this relates to what you will actually invest and what will you do as part of your work. So now that you've articulated all of these key components, there's a couple of extra steps in theory of change, which I think probably tend to differentiate it from other project planning and evaluation tools. And Kerstin has mentioned this in her slides beforehand. Once all of the key components are broken down and described, what a team or a project team tends to do in a theory of change process is really articulate how each component of the project links to the other. And normally this is done by organizing the information into what you might often see referred to as if-then statements. So if we invest these resources and deliver these activities, then we will produce these outputs, which will trigger outcomes and then lead to our impact. Now, the reason why a theory of change process encourages this type of articulation is because it can help you visually assess the logic behind your story. And this will become very important when it comes to evaluation. As Kerstin said, this then becomes what you might be able to test through your theory of change. Finally, there is a seventh step, which is about articulating assumptions that link each step. And that relates to kind of those arrows that you see. So why do we really think that this input is going to lead to this output? But we will come to assumptions later on in the presentation. So what effectively you have at the end of a process is that although you've done it backwards, what you have is a map, a story of your project. How a set of activities are thought to lead to certain deliverables that will then create a change. Now we can start looking just a couple of examples here on what each of these project components might be with reference to your Designscapes project. So the presenting problem, and we said that this is about articulating the issues that your project aims to solve. Now, to help frame the rest of the process, it's sometimes helpful to develop and articulate what is called a problem statement in just one or two sentences. So at this stage of the theory of change map, what you might be thinking about is, okay, well, what are the key issues in my local area? What are these issues being caused by, and how can they be solved, and who are they adversely affecting? But you can also think about, okay, well, what are the opportunities to help us overcome some of these problems? And here are just a couple of examples of problem statements that might be relevant or that you might be working with. So I'll just read them out. For example, too many young people in our area are not entering education, employment, or training. Or the deteriorating urban environment has negatively impacted the quality of life of residents, particularly younger and older people. Thirdly, and another example, cities are more congested than ever, and commuting behavior needs to change to more sustainable solutions. So these are just a couple of examples of problem statements, but we'll go on to see a live case later on. Inputs. Now, although this is done in a backwards mapping, here we're just going step by step. The inputs are essentially what is being invested, so the resources that are being invested into your projects. And there's a number of things that you might be thinking about here. Financial resources. So for you, it might be, well, it will be the Designscapes grant, for example, or any other co-funding that you're receiving from other sources. Aside from the financial resources, you'll be thinking about all the experience, expertise, and human resources that you need in order to implement your project. That may be internal to your organization, so it's the staff that you're bringing together to do the work, the staff time, volunteer time as well, if you have volunteers delivering the project. You will also think about actually expertise and knowledge that you need from wider connections or networks and organizations that you need that are fundamental to help you deliver the project. So any partner organizations you're working with, stakeholders, or any end user groups. Inputs also relate to the technology and materials. So these are all the things that you need to invest into a project. Activities. Activities are the things that you're actually implementing. So this is about stating what you're going to do or plan to do in order for your outcomes to be achieved. And again, these are some examples that might be of relevance to you in your Designscapes project. So for example, you might be planning to do stakeholder and end user involvement activities. For example, co-creation workshops or stakeholder mapping workshops, any software development activities, training or business planning activities. Outputs relate to what is produced through these activities, and normally this is quantifiable information. So the question is here, what will directly result from what we do that is important for change to happen? So here are some examples, and if we think about the activities outlined earlier, for example, stakeholder activities, business planning activities, software development activities, outputs to this might be, well, you come out at the end of the activities with a stakeholder map or an experience prototype or any software artifact, for example, an app or a business model canvas. What's perhaps helpful to bear in mind for outputs as well, this is where you might want to think about, well, what kind of response do you need from people you engage with to make sure that your outcomes can be achieved? So it can also be things like, okay, if you're delivering training, then did people like it? Did people find it appropriate? Were the materials appropriate? So these are additional things that you can think about when it comes to outputs. Outcomes, as we said, these refer to the changes, short to medium term changes that you need to see in order to tell you that you're on track towards achieving your longer term objectives. What's a tip here, what's useful to bear in mind is that change, of course, happens in stages. So you might want to think about a phased approach to changes and identify both immediate outcomes, and these tend to refer to changes in attitude, knowledge, and skills. So the changes that you might see shortly after your outputs or shortly after you deliver an activity. And then intermediate outcomes, which relate to things that take a little bit longer to be observed, such as changes in behaviors, in institutional structures or ways of working. So an example is here, an immediate outcome might be that you achieve improved understanding of end user needs, and further down the line, you will see increased use or take up of innovation. And equally, an immediate outcome might be that you increase awareness among stakeholders, which will then change into different way of working and local service delivery changes. Impacts are essentially your ultimate ambition for a change. So it's really what drives what you do. And here are some examples. So you might aim through your project to achieve a more sustainable management of urban resources, or to achieve greater gender equality or improved sense of safety and security. So these are kind of the bigger changes in what you overall aim to achieve. There's a couple of things to bear in mind that might be helpful. These can be a big change. So they might relate to or incorporate any national policy objectives that you're working towards or that your project feeds into, or any sort of local or regional strategies that you might be feeding into. What is not uncommon maybe in thinking about impacts is, especially if you're working with stakeholders, you might come up with a very long list of impacts. And it's useful at this stage to actually try and prioritize what your ultimate goal might be. And this is quite useful if you think of it in relation to your presenting problem. So in step one, so often a way of prioritizing is making sure that you focus on the aim that is very closely tied to what you're aiming to solve. This is also change that others will be contributing to, and this is especially the case for people like yourselves who are working in a very complex space, and so you're actually trying to tackle wicked problems, and it's very likely that your organization, your project, won't be the only thing present in the environment. So it can be a change that other people and other organizations will be contributing to. Okay. We're now going to move on assumptions. As we've said earlier, one step, a very important step in theory of change, is about articulating assumptions. But what are they? And it can be quite a tricky concept, but it's absolutely central to theory of change, and it is what differentiates it from other project planning or evaluation planning tools. So we all have them. Assumptions are effectively beliefs that we think are true, and they're beliefs about how we think a project will work, the people involved, and the external environment. Now, usually these assumptions come from our own viewpoints, value systems, experience, and background. They are tricky because what is difficult about assumptions is that they are not always valid, and we don't always articulate them because they sit in our heads, and we just assume that they are true. So a classic example is that we may implicitly think that as a result of our training, then participants will come out of the training and they'll have improved knowledge, skills, or awareness. Now, of course, what can happen there is that actually the training material might not be appropriate, or the wrong people attend the training for the wrong reasons. Now, in this case, your assumptions about improved knowledge and improved skills might not actually be true, and that creates a bit of an obstacle for your causal logic and for your overall plan. Therefore, articulating them through a theory of change process is really important because they help you manage risk. They can also help support you to understand whether what you believe to be true is actually supported by the evidence. Now, there's a number of examples, a number of assumptions that we make. So we make assumptions about the context. So, for example, we assume perhaps that the political, environmental, economic conditions that we're operating in are conducive to change. So this is standard for employment support programs, for example. If you aim to help particular target groups into work, an assumption you might be making is that there are decent paid jobs for people to get into in the first place. We make assumptions about causal links and about how we believe change happens. So one classic example might be we've seen the input component of a theory of change. So we might be working on the assumption that actually the resources we have are sufficient to carry out our activities. Or we might assume that participants automatically engage in our work because we have designed them in a way to meet their needs. So this is a further step. Once you have completed your kind of theory of change basic structure, coming up with assumption is just really a brainstorming session, really asking yourselves, why do we believe that this change is going to happen? Do we have the capacity to implement, and so on and so forth? Finally, indicators. Now, of course, we all want to make sure that the changes that we anticipate are actually happening. And doing a theory of change can be extremely helpful for developing measures of success, essentially, because we've mapped out our outcomes specifically and how one leads to the other. We can then track progress. And Kerstin mentioned this earlier on in kind of the benefits of theory of change for evaluation, for measuring our implementation. It's very important for indicators to be smart. And these are just some examples. Normally, we have output indicators, and these relate to us being able to track our project implementation. So things like number of stakeholder mapping workshops we've delivered, or the number and type of end users involved. And then we have outcome and impact indicators that help us measure the changes, or where we are, if we are on track with the changes we want to see. So for instance, an example of an outcome indicator is, collecting the number of local stakeholders collaborating to promote take-up of a prototype locally. And then towards the end of the map, you'll be thinking, okay, well, we have this collaboration. How many X tons of urban waste have we saved? We will now hand you over back to Kerstin to bring to life this theory of change in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Giorgia. So what we want to share with you is a case study where we are perhaps simulating how creating a theory of change might work. Now, so this is a case, in fact, from Designscapes. We are using it with the permission of the organization who came up with the project. It's a project which applied for a prototype, but unfortunately has not been as successful as you in this round of obtaining funding. But they've given permission for us to use it in this for this session. So here's the case. We've got a youth organisation based in South London, and they've really observed, staff from that organisation have really observed that vulnerable young people locally are increasingly marginalised, and that's because of a combination of regeneration, gentrification, and pressure on services locally. At the same time, that organisation feels that the approaches adopted locally to change the situation don't really work. They are too top-down, they're too much based on behavioral science, which don't really, but neither approach don't really work. So instead, the team, the youth workers in this organization believes that what is needed is involving young people in their own futures, and that involving them would have much more promising results on their inclusion. So they spot the Designscapes call for prototypes and want to apply, but in order to apply, they all come together, initially by themselves, maybe involving some local stakeholders, using theory of change as a tool to map out what this project needs to look like in order to make the change that they're looking to achieve. So they have at their disposal a theory of change template, which looks a bit like this. And they use simple technology like Post-its to map out the change journey. So where do they start? Well, as Giorgia said, they start with a problem locally. So the problem that they're observing is that young people in South London are disengaged. However, their potential needs to be realized if we're going to realize Europe's socio-ecological transition that will be needed as a result of climate change. Yet at the same time, the fundamental problem is that the current approaches adopted locally to including them don't work. So what is the impact they're looking to achieve? The impact they're looking to achieve is a reduced social exclusion of vulnerable young people. How does the team think they're going to get there? The team thinks that in order to achieve the ultimate impact of reduced social exclusion, they need to build young people's confidence and skills as an outcome. Young people also need to build their digital and social competencies if they're going to be included more. Then at the same time, local stakeholders need to be skilled up in design thinking to create different services. And ultimately, youth services locally need to become more effective. So these are the outcomes. Now, what are the outputs that the project should produce in order to get there? Right. So the first set of outputs is to do with what the young people are actually doing. So the young people locally need to be somehow equipped to find solutions to local problems through building apps or other technologies. There needs to be a space, which this team calls a lab locally, which has been tested and documented so that there's a plan which can be used by the local services going forward. There needs to be some kind of development program for local stakeholders to make sure they're skilled up in a different way of working, in particular using design thinking. Then if we're going to roll this idea out perhaps beyond South London, we need to understand the results that we've achieved, and we need to have a sustainability plan to make this work locally and possibly beyond. So this is what the team thinks the outputs should be. Now, what activities do the team think they need to implement? So the team think it's important to have co-creation workshops with local stakeholders and the young people themselves in order to design both the lab and the problem-solving activities. They need to have a service walkthrough and experience prototyping of the new solutions locally. And I think they need evaluation in order to have a rigorous assessment of results and confidence that the idea works. So what are the inputs? that they'll have. So they know they'll apply for a prototype grant from Designscapes, but they also know they've got a team based in this youth organization, which is multidisciplinary and which has got the right skills. So this is the project map that they've developed. They're beginning to think about what sort of key measures they might want to attach to these activities. Oh, no, first they think about assumptions. So first set of assumption is importantly related to activities. So the assumption is we're able to engage our disengaged youth locally. So they're documenting this because it's an obvious assumption to make, but as Giorgia said, we need to articulate it so we can test it. And in terms of outcomes, we're also assuming that stakeholders locally are prepared to change their ways of working. It's a big assumption if this project is going to work and have the impact that they're going to achieve. We then can think about measures. So at this stage, the team think actually one of the key measures that we need to measure is, are we running the right amount of workshops? So we want to monitor the number of co-creation workshops we're running. We also want to measure in terms of outcomes the increase of young people's confidence and skills. And we can do this through, they can think about that later, how they do this. Normally we do this through surveys or conversations. And then, of course, we also need to measure how many young people have engaged. If you're failing to engage young people in the process, the whole project collapses. So these are some of the key results and process measures that the team at this stage think they need to employ. And you can see that they're very closely linked to the initial steps of the theory of change. Now, after this workshop, somebody goes away, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but a different way of representing this work could be this. So it's exactly the same content, but what this map does is it uses arrows, you see the blue arrows, in between the different theory of change categories to, if you want, tell the change story through the if-then statements by linking different elements of the presenting problems, input, activities, output, and outputs, outcomes, and impacts. So one can read the change story. So the interesting thing about theory of change is whilst we're doing backward mapping, we're actually reading it from left to right once we've done it. So the change story would be, say, if we have a situation where young people are disengaged locally and we're using our Designscapes funding wisely, creating the right number of workshops, then we're able to activate young people to create local solutions to local problems. Through that activity, young people apply their talent to solve community problems. And as a result, overall, they will be more included. So social exclusion of young people will be reduced locally. So this is how we can read the arrows. The other thing you'll notice is the colors. So again, there's no rules, but if helpful, such maps can be color-coded. For instance, what the team might have noticed at the end of the workshop is that there are different strands of activities that they're proposing. So the salmon pink strand, if you like, refers to all the results and outcomes and activities targeting young people specifically. The purplish blue strand is focused on youth and other, in the UK you would say statutory services locally. And the green strand is about research and evaluation. Now, of course, in real life they're interlinked, but sometimes it makes sense to color code them slightly differently if one wanted to communicate aspects of the program or if it makes sense analytically for the project team. So this is often an example of how an output might look like from one of those workshops. I will now hand you over to Giorgia again to spend a little bit of time to talk about some hints and tips on designing and developing a theory of change.
Oh. Okay, so this is just, yes, as Kerstin said, just some hints and tips to bear in mind. And apologies. Now, it might be quite common as you go through a theory of change workshop to actually ask yourself or to ask oneself, how do we know if we've done a good enough or a good theory of change? Now, again, it's useful to note that there is no one size fits all, but there are some general principles that actually underpin what a good quality theory of change is. So we said this at the beginning. A good theory of change has been done collaboratively, and this is what we started with in Kerstin's session. It's absolutely crucial for stakeholders to be involved in a theory of change process because it can ensure alignment and it increases ownership, both of the project but also of the evaluation. Is it plausible? And this refers to the logic of your pathways of change. So actually, once you've done the theory of change and come up with the map that perhaps Kerstin showed earlier, does it make sense, or are there any particular leaps between one component of the project that is just, doesn't quite ring true? Is it feasible and testable? And the feasibility refers to how realistic it is. So how, in reality, can you achieve the outcomes that you've set yourself to achieve? Do you have enough resources for the scale of the project that you've kind of identified in your theory of change mapping? Or do you need to revisit something? And is it testable? Now, this refers to how specific your theory of change is and to the strength of your indicators. So do you have something that you can actually gather data and test? Finally, is it iterative? Now, we always stress this when we do sort of evaluation training of all kinds. A theory of change should not be a one-off thing that you do. You shouldn't come up with a map and then leave it on the desk and never look at it again, because actually a good theory of change is constantly revisited, refined, and adapted as ongoing learning is generated through the project. Another set of tips, here's again is our basic theory of change structure. And there, if you're not familiar with it, that is a map of the London Underground tube system. Now, there's a reason why we've put these together, and it's actually quite useful to think about a London Underground map, in fact, of any major city, for a number of reasons. Now, you might find, and those of you who have done theory of change before, it's a classic when people really get stuck and worry about the terminology. So what is the difference between an input and an activity, or an output and an outcome? And I'll be honest with you, when we were drawing up the case example, I got a bit stuck on, oh my goodness, like we both did. And partly the struggle is that because through a theory of change process, what you're trying to do is to actually map something that is constantly changing. So actually what might be an output at one point might actually then transform into an input of a different type of activity that you might still be delivering. Also, people use the same terminology differently. So what might be an output for one person might be an outcome for another. I actually once witnessed a 20-minute conversation in a small working group between the difference between an output and an outcome. Now, all this is fine, but if you do get stuck into that space, it's actually worth remembering the underground map. Because the question isn't necessarily, am I using the right terminology and am I actually representing reality? It's more about, is this theory of change map helpful? Is it helpful for the evaluation, in designing a project, or in communicating with others? Because actually, if an underground map were designed in exactly the way to represent reality, nobody would probably be able to get anywhere. So it's really a tool to help you get from A to B. Running a theory of change workshops, these are just some tips that we've learned through our practice, and just if you wanted to run a theory of change workshops, it's just some things to think about. So again, invite key people in the process, and doing so by thinking systemically. So of course, exactly who you involve will depend on what you're setting out to achieve. But the crucial thing here is to involve people with the knowledge, experience, and insight to help you answer the questions you're asking. And there's also different ways of doing it. So you might identify a core group of people that are absolutely central, and there's nothing stopping you from then sharing the theory of change more widely with a slightly more sort of peripheral group. Do budget the time. I mean, there are some theory of change workshops that can actually go on for 2-3 days, which might be a bit much, but definitely at least budget 3 hours or half a day, because as you might be very familiar with, going through that process generates a lot of discussion, but it's worth putting in the time. Design for inclusivity. So here is just make sure you kind of facilitate the process, enabling the diversity of stakeholders really have an input into the theory of change process, and use props and post-its and colors. And Kerstin has shown the simulation. Sometimes you can just like, I've done it with sticky wallpaper, a long sort of brown paper on the wall where people just constructed a theory of change using different colors and post-its and papers. You can prepare prompts if you think it will help, and that might be, you know, sometimes, especially if you have not a huge amount of time, you can get to the workshop with a kind of a half-constructed theory of change or some activities and outputs, and people can start with that. Remember to focus on the why and the how, so to start with where you want to get to. So not just focusing on activities, but actually thinking, where do we need to go? Do expect different views on outcomes, and this can happen inevitably with, you know, different stakeholders having different views on what a project aims to achieve, but it's important to include that in a theory of change. Finally, consider the timescales towards achieving outputs and goals. You know, how long is an outcome going to take? When are you anticipating changes to happen? And this is important because it can help you decide what the most appropriate evaluation strategy is for you to use.
Thanks, Giorgia. So this is just really to take a minute or so to wrap up what we've said. So as you will have picked up, we would really encourage you to use theory of change as part of your work on the prototype. There are really 4 reasons for that. Clarity about causal pathways, assessing what understanding and confidence about what works, helping you with scaling, and helping you with the reporting at the end of your project. There's also something about contributing to perhaps the design-enabled innovation community as a whole, and certainly Designscapes. So if we're all working, so we are using theory of change as a framework for the Designscapes evaluation overall. If we're all working towards the same framework, it'll allow us to potentially tap into the work and the results reporting that you do. And you're also testing and using a way of working which could become an exemplar for the sector as a whole. There's a lot of work you will have already done on theory of change, whether you've explicitly constructed one using this terminology or method or not, simply by virtue of applying and completing the application form. And you'll see in the slides some of the sections that that will have relevant information. So if you were to now, after this webinar, go away and construct one for your prototype project, which we would encourage you to do, this is where you could start, bearing in mind that of course you've already done several weeks worth of work. So actually the information in the application form may already need to be updated. And again, to reiterate that we would expect that to happen. So that's a good thing and the normal process of a theory of change development process. what we're offering you is some resources which you may or may not want to use. So as part of the slide pack, you'll see we've produced a couple of templates. The one you've seen we've already used as part of the simulation. So this is a simple one. It is simple, but we keep on using it in all of the training activities we're doing with civil servants in the UK as well as internationally, and it's very effective. But of course open to improvement and changes and adaptation. And this is a similar format which just puts in some boxes for indicators. There is help and support available through the Designscapes program. So you're very much encouraged to use the Facebook Learning community for some peer learning, asking questions about how to do it. You may be aware that you have contact points within the Designscapes consortium who you're very welcome to approach for questions. We, as the evaluation team, we are in the process of organizing some dates for some regular open surgeries where you'll be able to dial in and come up with any sort of specific questions related to your work, to your theory of change, to kind of evaluation task. And we'll communicate that shortly. And as part of this pack, we've put together a whole selection of resources, which you're very welcome to look at. So these range from specific publications in theory of change to the Aspen Institute work that's there as an absolute classic, to some guidance on how to do theory of change in practice, some videos, including the video we showed earlier, but which was maybe a bit too basic for the knowledge that you're already bringing to this webinar. A number of others, and there's a number of open sort of MOOC type courses which, should you want to take them, you could do as well. So this is the offer, and with that resources section we will close the presentation part of the webinar, but very much like to take a few minutes to open the floor to you guys and invite any questions, comments, reactions that you would like to share. So I will mute myself and in order to avoid feedback and see whether there's anyone who would like to share.
Hi there, this is Aldo speaking. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi Aldo.
Hi there. Hi there. Oh, by the way, I hear a terrible echo. This is not going to work. I don't know. So there's some feedback somewhere. Maybe somebody else can close their mic. Hello? Hello?
I believe all the mics are closed.
Apart from yours, maybe. Maybe could you close it just to check?
I closed mine. I've just opened it now, so I will close it again. I think all the others are closed, so just have a go.
Okay. Well, I steer myself. Whoa, no, that's not working.
Do you want to use the chat?
I'll use the chat instead. So somebody else can talk and I'll chat.
Aldo, did you see Besnick's comments? Thank you, Besnick. So if you can correct that, then we might have the benefit of hearing you.
Try again.
Besnick thinks you might get an echo because you're logged on with 2 accounts. Anyhow, while we're sorting that out, if there's somebody else who might want to come in, then feel free. Otherwise, we will wait for Aldo, whether there's a point he will make in the chat. Thank you for finding it helpful. presentation. Anyone else having any thoughts, questions, reactions, criticism? Thanks, Aldo. Is there someone else who would like to come in, maybe with audio or with chat? Okay, so perhaps I will take that as a no, unless in the next minute or so somebody is coming forward. So I will take this as a no. I'm hoping you will have found this useful, maybe sparked some ideas, some ways, different ways of working. We will share the slides, follow-up survey, and the dates for surgeries with you shortly. Any other comments after this event through any means, of course, always welcome. The next webinars will be advertised closer to the dates, but as soon as possible. Giorgia and I would like to thank you very much for joining us today, and hope to meet you and connect with you in other ways throughout the next weeks and months. Thank you very much, and have a very good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kerstin and Giorgia.
No problem. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.